All right, everybody, welcome to Business Ethics. I am your professor for this course, Dr. Anthony Shakal, and this will be the first in a series of lecture videos on business ethics. So in these videos, this is generally how it goes. I lay out at the top of the video right now all the various things that we're going to cover in the video, and then I go through them point by point, and then at the end of the video, I sum up everything that we went over. So there are three sort of headings that I want to cover today. Number one is just a basic kind of an intro lecture into business ethics with some provocative slogans that we can start out considering. The next is we'll go over 4 or 5 prominent ethical theories that will help guide our analysis throughout these questions relevant for particular issues in business ethics. And then we will go over some of the articles in Chapter 1, and we will put particular emphasis on the first reading by Bowie, who draws on Kant's philosophy a lot. So when I make these lecture videos, I tend to walk because I think better when I'm walking, and I like to have some movement for you guys to observe. So it's 20 degrees here in Pittsburgh. We'll see how long I last on the walk, but let's get going. Okay, so now the 3 slogans to get us started off in thinking about business ethics are these. Number 1, it's just business. Think about that phrase, if you've heard that phrase before. It's just business. Maybe you've heard it in a movie, maybe you've heard someone who owns a business say it. So think about, have you heard this phrase, it's just business, and what kind of work is it doing to justify some kind of behavior? I'll return to that in a second. The next line we can consider is something similar, the phrase, I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing my job. This is my job. I didn't design this job. I'm simply working this job. I don't control the system of this job. This is just my job and I'm doing it. Okay? And then number 3, the idea that the point of a business is to make money. Okay? So the point of a business is to make money. People say that a lot when they're trying to push back against someone perhaps pointing out that they're doing something wrong or unscrupulous, or that they should change what they're doing, and people say, well, there might be some negative consequences for how I run this business, but the point of a business is to make money, and that's my central line of thinking. So, in each of these 3 lines, these 3 propositions, these 3 slogans, we get a certain notion of business. So, it's just business, the first one. Again, all 3 of these seem to be able to sort of justify immoral behavior under the justification, under the rationale that if we're doing business, we don't have to follow moral rules, because the point of a business is to make money. I am just one person within this larger system doing my job. Therefore, in an effort to have this business, I don't really need to concern myself with moral behavior. So what I'm suggesting to you as an introduction to this class is, let's try to gauge the way people already think about business in relation to ethics. And what I'm suggesting is that people think, not everybody, but a certain way of thinking about business that is probably influenced by a lot of capitalist thinking, is the idea that the point of a business is to make as much money as possible. Given the fact that that is the objective, things like morality and ethics, how we affect other people, whether or not we're doing something wrong, even if it's not illegal, those don't get kind of equal consideration as the central consideration of let's make as much money as we can as the priority that gets. All right, so, think about where you've heard this kind of thinking before. It's just business. I'm just doing my job. The point of a business is to make money. And ask yourself if you agree with my suggestion in that it provides a certain kind of thinking that implies business is unethical or business has no concern with ethics. All right, so that's the first thing to consider, and I'll be going back to that point throughout the semester in a variety of lectures, and we'll see how these ideas play out. Okay, so that's part one, just a general kind of introduction. So now let me get into what ethics actually is. So we are in the philosophy department. This class is offered in the philosophy department. There are various major branches of philosophy, one of which is ethics. And the term ethics comes from an ancient Greek word meaning ethos, which means character, and it refers to a person's character and how they act. Morality, which is very similar to ethics, comes from a Latin rather than a Greek root, moralis, and it means law. So ethics then is the sort of moral rules or laws that we follow that govern and speak to our character. Now, one of the central questions in ethics is this: do right and wrong actually exist objectively? So one way to think about that is, if all the human beings dropped dead, would right and wrong still exist? If it existed independently or objectively of human beings, then right and wrong would exist, even if all the human beings dropped dead. But if morality is somehow dependent on the existence of human beings, on their thinking about what morality is, if it is subjective or if it is human dependent, then if all the human beings drop dead, then morality wouldn't exist either. So the people that believe in God think that morality is objective, God decides what's right and wrong, and he communicates that to us. People who are atheists or agnostic or non-believers say, maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't, but at the very least, human beings tend to make morality. Therefore, if they disappeared, morality would too. So that's the first question. Is morality something real and objective, independent of human beings, or is it something that we create? And if we create, then we create it differently depending on time and place. So that's why you get different cultures at different times and places, or even the same culture at a different time, living by different moral rules. So this is the difference between moral objectivism, and moral or cultural relativism. So philosophers say, well, it's hard to say whether or not morality really exists because it really depends on the question whether or not God exists. And philosophers try their best to argue for the existence of God. Some try to argue against the existence of God. But what we do know, and this is a type of thinking that came out of the Enlightenment era, about the 18th century, is that we don't necessarily need God to determine what is right and wrong, because God gave us a sense of reason, and we can use our reason to come to these determinations. So what we can use then is rational thinking, and that's exactly what philosophy is. So philosophers try to formulate different theories about the good, different moral theories about what is right. So now I'm going to tell you about some of the prominent moral theories. So number one is relates to the reading, the first reading in chapter 1, Bowie's article. And Bowie is talking a lot about this German philosopher named Kant. And his theory is just referred to as Kantianism. So one of the central questions about moral theory is, should we follow certain rules across the board no matter what? Or should we determine what actions we should do depending on the consequences? So if one action, a single action, can produce good consequences on one day and bad on the other, then we're going to leave it to what actually happens to guide us as to whether or not we should do it. Whereas the first option, which is called deontology, says no, we shouldn't be looking at the consequences. We should just be consistently following moral rules across the board. So that's deontology, and that's where Kant follows. And the other category is consequentialism, and that's where utilitarianism follows. So Kant thinks that being moral is about a matter of being rational, and that this really entails two things. Number one, we should never do anything that we would not obligate everybody else to do. So yes, this sounds a little bit like the golden rule, treat others how you would want to be treated, but it's a little stronger than that. So if I'm walking down the street and I find a wallet, I ask myself, anybody that would encounter a wallet, would I tell them that they had an obligation to return the wallet? Not simply that they should return the wallet, but that they would be wrong if they didn't. Is that something that I would be willing to take and make into a universal law? Would I be willing to take this idea, always return lost wallets to their proper owner? Would I be willing to make that into a universal law that I think everybody, no matter time or place, would be willing to follow, or should have to follow? If I'm willing to make that kind of universal commitment, then Kant says, I've determined that the action is moral and therefore I have a duty to do it. So really the test of morality for Kant is about being rational, and the rational test is whether or not you would be willing to obligate everyone else to do what you're about to do. So Kant calls that the categorical imperative, and that's part one. It's called the universal formulation, because it's about expecting everybody else, or willing, obligating everybody else to do what you're about to do. But Bowie's article is really centered more on the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which has to do with respect for persons. So Kant says this: we are rational, and being rational makes us free. These two things, our rationality and our freedom, is what allows us to have dignity, human dignity, right? So Kant thinks that we're above the other kinds of animals and mammals, and although we might be like them in some ways, the main difference is that we can be rational. We can do mathematics, we can create languages and uncover bodies of knowledge and date fossils and put people on the moon and so forth, right? So we have reason that separates us, that gives us what he calls a kind of dignity. And any beings that rise to this level of dignity are deserving of moral respect. So what this means, and this is going to be very guiding for business ethics, is that we ought not ever use people by violating their dignity and treating them merely as a means to an end. We should not objectify or instrumentalize people. So when you think about walking into a sweatshop where little children are putting together the iPhone that I'm making this video on, you could treat that as a violation of the humanity formulation. So the first one was called the universal formulation. This is humanity, because we need to respect the humanity and dignity of everybody. So that's what Kant thinks, and really morality, as I said, is about being rational and following those two formulations. The most prominent theory in the other most prominent category is utilitarianism. That's a consequentialist theory because it says morality is going to depend on the consequences of actions. And John Stuart Mill is the representative example here, and he says that we should always do the actions that produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. So that will be the central theory under consequentialism, that certain actions, they're not right or wrong in themselves. They're right or wrong depending on the consequences they produce. So if telling a lie produces bad consequences on Tuesday but good ones on Wednesday, don't do it on Tuesday and lie on Wednesday. But there's nothing so sacred in the action itself that says we should always adhere to it or always not. It really depends on the consequences. Now, certain things typically produce the same kinds of consequences. So, murdering random people produces negative consequences and doesn't ever produce good consequences. So, you could think of it as always being wrong. So that's utilitarianism. The next theory we can call is called virtue ethics, and the representative philosopher here is Aristotle. Remember I told you that ethics or ethos meant character. Well, that's what takes center stage in virtue ethics. Whereas in deontology, Kantianism, and consequentialism, utilitarianism, the question there is really, what actions should I do? What actions should I perform? But the question in virtue ethics is more, what person should I be? What kind of character should I have? It's not so much do I want to tell a lie, but rather, do I want to be a liar? It's not so much do I want to give to this particular charity this one time, but rather, do I want to be a charitable person? Do I want to be a giving, compassionate, charitable, generous person? So other virtues would